We the People is a new podcast where the political is personal. This is not a show about the never-ending turmoil of the partisan wars in Washington. This show is about the myriad ways in which politics affects the everyday lives of people like you and I. We aren't interested in acting or talking like pundits or politicians. This podcast is about what ordinary people can do in response to the greatest issues, problems, and policies of the day. Welcome to We the People. I'm Erin Goebel-Lynch.
And I'm Kenny Woodfolk. And later today we'll talk about how we can take a call to action to this main topic. Joining me today is Joining me with Erin is Lacey Pittman Tomanek, and we have Amber Sims. Let's dive right in.
It's been widely reported that since the election of Donald Trump in November of 2016, there's been a sharp increase in the number of reported hate crimes across the U.S. We saw the faces of this hatred when we watched tiki torch-wielding, khaki pants-wearing neo-Nazi douche bros march unabashedly in the streets of Charlottesville. We saw this hate acted upon in the execution of 9 people at Emmanuel African Methodist Church in Charleston, and in the massacre that ended 11 lives at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. We've seen this hate internationally in the recent brutal slaying of members of the Christchurch Mosque, and in so many others around the globe. These horrific events have rightly terrified communities of color, and they have also served as a catalyst for anti-racist community organizing, protest, and calls for systemic change. But the truth is, the election of Donald Trump didn't mark a great revival of hate crimes in this country. In fact, there's been an increase in reported hate crimes every year since 1990, when the Hate Crime Statistic Act was first passed by Congress. When I first read that, I found myself wondering what's happened in the last 29 years that might explain this consistent rise in prejudice-based violence, and a few events came to mind. As an older millennial, there are a few things that happened during my childhood, adolescence, and young adult life that I remember as shaping the way that I and many others were brought up to understand the world around us. In 1992, the beating of Rodney King horrified America, but the subsequent LA riots shook the foundations of white society, challenging notions of white safety. In 1994, the infamous crime bill, otherwise known as the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which was written by Joe Biden, passed by Congress, and signed into law by Bill Clinton, changed the way our criminal justice system operated. We watched the news nightly as black criminality was paraded across our television screens, and then we changed the channel to Home Improvement or Full House or some other idyllic picture of white American life. All the while, our prisons began swelling with the incarcerated bodies of black and Latino boys and men. In 1995, the O.J. Simpson trial was watched and rewatched every night at our dinner table in Southern California, as it was at tables across the country. When the verdict was announced, Black America seemed to rejoice that in so corrupt a county as LA, a black man could walk free, while white America seemed to find itself personally wronged, as though the slaying of a white woman meant so much less than the walking free of a black millionaire. And then in 2001, white animosity seemed to shift away from the black and African American communities, away from the Latinx community, and it found a new home in Islamophobic rage. The events of 9/11 and the ensuing calamitous war in the Middle East changed our country in a profound and lasting way. In 2008, the election of Barack Obama was seen by some as a hallmark moment in anti-racist politics. Pundits informed us that we were now living in a post-racial America. Meanwhile, something was brewing on the right. For many, it was a distaste tinged by quiet racist views that allowed them to give more and more power to Mitch McConnell and his cronies. It was the birth of the Tea Party. It also represented the start of a new chapter in the white nationalist movement. When I think of these 5 events among a host of others, I can see a line between them and an increase in hate crimes. White America was frightened, and like an animal that believes itself backed into a corner, white America lashed out. Some with the vote, others with means more violent. Many found that lashing out became a comfortable way of life. It made them feel powerful. They found secret corners of the internet on which to conspire and plot. They embraced radicalization and found that society collectively wasn't so bothered that anyone was actually going to stand up and stop them en masse. The election of Donald Trump didn't start all of this, but what it did seem to do was circle the wagons of hate around a multitude of communities. Black, brown, immigrant, Muslim, women, all were suspect. All have come to be victimized under this administration. Last month, YouTube made a change to its hate speech policy, declaring that it would henceforth ban videos, quote, alleging that a group is superior in order to justify discrimination, segregation, or exclusion. Included in this ban would be any groups that glorify Nazi ideology. We can talk about whether or not this sort of censorship is for the greater good, or if it actually infringes on the liberties guaranteed in the First Amendment. We can talk about whether this move on the part of YouTube goes far enough in the interest of public safety. But what we must talk about is whose responsibility it is to curb the instincts and very nature of hate-related violence and white supremacy in this country. Does this fall to corporations such as YouTube and Facebook, or to those in the media who routinely find themselves seeking balance at the expense of good reporting? Is this the responsibility of those elected to power in local, state, and federal governments? Or is curtailing and eliminating white supremacy in this country the role of we the people?
You know, that's an earful. I mean, you know, we can start at any one of those incidents that you mentioned. I personally think that African Americans also play a role in that as well, as setting our own perceptions. You know, people see us. You know, we have the control we have the ability to let people know exactly how we want them to see us. You know, and if we don't step up ourselves, then we're just feeding to this stereotypical supremacist thought process and ideologies that some of these people who have those negative views about us, we're not helping them. So I'm not here to talk about how bad we are, you know what I mean? But, you know, based on the topic of today, white supremacy, it's everywhere, you know. I would frame it like this. If we are, as a people, because we have to get back to the basics, I think getting back to the basics, meaning that we should actually be sitting back and trying to think about how we can enhance the lives of everyone instead of just being self-centered amongst ourselves. If we start that process, I mean, it has to start somewhere. And I think it's a multifaceted thing. We can't just start with one person and say one issue will change this other. All things have to happen at the same time. So that's how I would start that discussion. Amber? I'm throwing it to you. I'm just going to throw it to you.
I believe that, thank you, Aaron, for a great rundown of the history, right? Because this didn't come out of thin air, the things that we'll be talking about today. And it came because of structures. It's because we think that when Brown versus the Board of Education was made rule of the land, that things changed dramatically, and in fact they did not. Things changed, they evolved. And so when we talk about racism and how it started, we really have to talk about the different forms that racism took on. We have to talk about the creation of suburbs in our cities. We have to talk about why we're right outside of it, Arlington, right? In a place called Pantego.
Yes.
Right? Which is a suburb of a suburb.
Right.
And what the changing demographics went, and we have to talk about white flight. And then we, have to do a lot about talking about, I know we'll get to this, about the levels of racism and what the internalization of racism means for people of color. And one of the phrases that I'll drop before we get started is the white gaze.
Yep.
Because I think, if his eye is on the sparrow, right?
That's right.
The power of the white gaze and what that means as people of color, how we interact and maneuver within this world.
Well, let's start there. Let's talk about how we define racism in our culture, because I think it's so easy for people to say, oh, you're wielding a tiki torch, you're shouting Jews will not replace us, you're burning down a synagogue, you're attacking a mosque or a church. That's racism. Right, and I think that that's an enormous mistake that our media makes constantly. So let's break down what is racism in our society. What are those different levels you mentioned?
Yeah, and so racism is defined as prejudice, which we all have. Black, brown, white people, all people of color. And then the thing and the crucial ingredient that is important when we're talking about racism is power.
Right.
Okay, and so all of us can have prejudices that have been created within the systems that we live, and yet when those prejudices are equated with power, we get racism.
Right.
And so racism allows folks, white people, right, who have power in their system to be able to benefit. I mean, from being white.
Absolutely.
And not white, but whiteness as a construct. And
Right.
I think that's one of the things that we really miss, is that whiteness is a construct that goes beyond us looking at Lacey and Aaron and knowing that you all are white people, but then within the constructs and the framework, you are operating within a system of whiteness, right, and white supremacy, and that system continues to be fed by the policies that are enacted and by the way that we interact with the world. And then I think the other thing that I'll add is like when we talk about the 4 levels of racism and why I was really intentional, and thank you for agreeing with this, Aaron, is I'm done credentialing myself as a Black woman.
Right.
Don't ask me who I am, who I
Right.
work for, where I'm from. I don't have to do that. Now, if
Right.
we're going to engage in a conversation and a dialogue and you can get to know me, that's totally fine. But as far as me, Amber Sims, telling you what job I have, what schools I went to, what credentials I have,
Right.
in order for you to see me and hear me, done with it. Absolutely done with it.
That's interesting.
And so, and that is interpersonal racism, right? And so that is people coming up to me every day and being like, why are you as a Black person in this space?
Interesting.
Right?
Interesting. Yeah.
And then because of people, you know, when you think about crimes and the crimes that are put against Black people, the largest crimes are around space,
Right.
around the existence of Black people, right? And so then that becomes institutionalized and it
Right.
becomes systemic. And I can say, because you were hanging outside of this
Right.
building,
Right.
why are you here?
Right.
And if you don't say something like you're the owner, which I might not believe, or that you have a right to
Right.
be here,
Right.
I'm gonna write that up.
Yeah.
Okay. And those are how these systems are being placed. And so I'm placing myself outside of the
Gotcha.
roles that define me as a credentialed Black person, and y'all just gonna have to get to know me.
Works for me.
Lacey, I want to bounce something off of you. I was thinking about this morning, that one of the primary benefits of being white in a white majority society is the assumption that you're exempt from critical analysis of your whiteness.
Interesting. Wow. Okay.
What do you think about that? Like, what comes to mind when you think about the fact that we don't have to examine our whiteness,
Yeah.
right? Society doesn't demand that of us.
Yeah.
But we obviously should, but
Yeah, I mean, I think you can go through your whole life and not ever question that. And the ironic thing is, it's whether you're rich or you're poor. If you were white, you were actually just exempt outside of your socioeconomic status, outside of sometimes even your gender, your sexual orientation, all these other, intersex. And you were asking about, the construct or the definition or the history of racism, and you also talked about your own socialization. And I'm an older millennial too, and everything that you said just completely resonated with me.
So am I. No, I'm
Yeah.
kidding. No, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. Go
You
ahead.
look great, Kenny. You look great.
Thank you.
And I think about, growing up here in the DFW area, the very implicit and the very explicit messages I received about race and my place and my superiority or my expectations as a white person. Everything from, you can't watch those kinds of television shows, or you can't listen to that kind of music, or you can't hang out with the kids from the apartments. And I think even from a young age, I questioned that and examined that and thought about that. And this idea of, color blindness, we actually don't see race, is like the most privileged
Right.
concept
Yeah.
that there is, right? And when the history of racism is about how far you are from Blackness, even the gradients of racism within communities of color, like how far you are from Blackness determines your worth.
Right.
That's how our country was founded. And so, yeah, I mean, in 2019, you can still absolutely walk through your life every day unexamined as a white person. And in fact, I would say, now we're blaming our whiteness for things.
Right.
Right.
Which is so,
Right.
so funny. When we don't get into the college of our choice, we're blaming our whiteness. When we don't get our job,
Right.
we're blaming our whiteness. Newsflash, there is no such thing as reverse racism.
No.
or
it doesn't-
reverse
you're right.
affirmative
Absolutely.
action
You're
or
right.
anything like
Right.
that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I like to focus when it comes to this issue. Being a Black man in America, growing up in Washington D.C., a very political city. I like to go back to the root cause analysis. Let's do a root cause analysis right now. Let's go back to slavery. This is where it all started. There was a supremacy built on the foundation of this country. There were slaves who weren't even considered humans. Then it became partial human. And then there was the 13th Amendment, which allowed us to be free. They had the same, supposedly had the same opportunities. Then there was the 14th Amendment, which meant that if you're born in the United States, no matter where you come from, because there were generations of slaves here in the States. If you're born here, then of course, now you're considered a U.S. citizen, protected under the Constitution. Then the 15th Amendment allowed us to vote, right? But even that had certain things that still blocked us from voting, because women didn't vote to win.
White women or?
Well, yeah, 1920.
20.
Yeah, 1920. Mm-hmm.
So let's go back to that, and that's where it started. Because if you don't start from the beginning, you're kind of coming in the middle. You know what I'm saying? Just like you're trying to, throw some filling in a cake before it's. Anyway, wrong analogy. But anyway, so if we go back and we look at history, we look at things that's happening. This white supremacy thing that's been building over time, and once we were free, there was what was it? Jim Crow. Jim Crow, and then there was what was it? Ferguson versus got the other guy. Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Mm-hmm. Which meant that equal, and there was, in other words, we can have the same things you have, but we got to have it somewhere else. Pretty much. That started. Then there was a lot of hatred. So there's generation of white supremacy that came out of this thing right here in the United States. But you look at how the nation was divided. Before Lincoln he's the one who actually pushed the 13th Amendment, but there was two societies. There was those who wanted slaves and those who didn't. I don't think too many people didn't want slavery. They just didn't want to be a part of it. They didn't support the abolition of slavery. There were people like, okay, something. It's just one of those things that, everybody else doing it, so why can't I do it too? And it's profitable. But it wasn't necessary in the North because they had manufacturing plants and everything else, where the South relied on that. So I can understand the anger. And then there was a lot of illiteracy here in the South. They say the illiteracy rate was, only 4.5% of the population at the time actually had some type of education. And most of those folks were probably landowners and owned slaves and had all the money. So there was a systematic thing that was happening, that was continual, which brought us to our present day. I like your analogy, Aaron, when you came up and you mentioned all these things. Yeah, these things are some of the, if I can just say, they were some of the elements that created the environment for Trump. Mm-hmm. Certain things just haven't changed, and then you have these political parties that are been completely divided because the Republicans were the party of Lincoln. Didn't he actually invent, him and Blair actually came up with the Republican Party?
Yeah, but that really speaks to a misunderstanding of party alignment and the flips that we've gone through over time. That's such a line that I'm so sick of hearing Republicans use, right? Yeah. You don't get to be bigots and racists and then claim Lincoln. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It's nonsense.
You're right.
It's absolute nonsense.
You're right. So, so we all live under, coming up in Washington, D.C. is a very transit city, where, the population changes every 4 to 6 years. Because of the federal government and how it changes. People coming to Washington, D.C. from different parts of the country to work with the federal government. And it normally changes over different administrations. And then there's the people that's been there the whole time. When I was a kid, the city was 80, 84, 85% African American. So the only white people I saw were the teachers and the doctors, and the teachers were Jews. Some of the doctors were Jewish in the city because they couldn't get hired anywhere else. They could not get hired anywhere else. So, but then they decided the Jewish culture, which is something that I kind of appreciate. They gone through similar struggles. They gone to some struggles, but they decided no more. It's not going to happen again. So it's a constant reminder of hey, we're going to constantly remind everybody that we're not going through this anymore. The Holocaust was a horrible thing. It didn't happen here in the States, but it was discrimination against them as well. So is it white supremacy or is it just supremacy that's controlled by white people?
It's definitely white supremacy.
Okay.
And there's a great book, you talk about having been in DC, there's a great book by an author, Ibram Kendi, that was formerly at the University of Florida, and he's at, I want to say, American University, and he just created a race studies program there. But anyhow, what he does is really trace the history of race in this country, and so we know that race was created. And we also know that people were discriminated against across this world, right? But never was it defined in such terms as that of race, and in which dehumanizing people to the degree that has happened in this country. And the other thing to make clear about folks being Jewish is that Jewish is a religion and not a race. And so there is a time when you look in the history of Dallas and other cities that yes, Jewish people were discriminated against, but Jewish people also became white.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean, that's complicated because Jewish, it is an ethnicity, right? You can be by blood Jewish and then still reject the religion. Plenty of people who are culturally Jewish or by blood. But I take your point.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like you are racially white or whatever your race is, and then ethnically, right? And that's the same conversation that happens with Latinx people in this country and that's the thing that people miss is like, why do we have this upsurgence of whiteness? Because Latinx people can be white. Right. Racially and ethnically, they can be Cuban, Mexican, Brazil, you know, whatever those things are. Just like Jewish people can be Polish, German, you know, whatever that is. And I mean, there are very terse points between we have to speak on this too, between the Jewish and the Black community. I mean, writers like Alice Walker has been personally persecuted for her views on you know, called anti-Semitic and vice versa, you know, and so that's it's a very hard thing to unpack and unravel, but we also have to remember, like Lacey pointed out, that we are literally talking about people's proximity to Blackness and how far they are away from Blackness, and that is a thing. And so when we are talking about spectrums, we are talking about a spectrum that is white over here and Black over here, and everyone else has been moving. And so there was a time that Jewish people were extremely persecuted against. There is also a time in which Jewish people became white. There are Republican branches of, you know, the Jewish population. There is also a time when Muslim people had nothing to worry about in this country, right? And so the other thing to add to this is like we are constantly being politicized and race is political. And that's just an important thing to remember as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk, we've kind of touched on it without naming this yet, but I want to talk about this concept of white fragility and why it's so damn difficult for white people to own up to the fact that you have a seed of racism in you, right? Why we get so defensive, why we can't just handle having that conversation. Lacey, I want to start with you.
Yeah, I was like, come on, Lacey.
Get it, girl. Get it, girl.
Amber's like, yeah. Listen, like white supremacy is all about power and control and fear. And it is scary to give up power. If you believe that power is a limited resource and not everyone can share in or have power, you are going to hold on to that as much as you can in whatever way you can, in the most effective way you can at any given time, which is why I think the effects of white supremacy or how we perpetuate white supremacy has evolved so much over time because it's like whatever the flavor of the day, whatever is acceptable, socially acceptable at that time is what white people and sometimes non-white people will do to maintain white supremacy. And so, you know, when I hear the term white fragility, of course, a huge part of me rolls my eyes because I know that a white person's inability to examine themselves, to your question earlier, or to engage in conversations about race, or to think about divesting of power, is what is allowing white supremacy to continue. And at the same time, I feel some compassion or some understanding or some empathy in the sense that I know what it is like to be the person who benefits from this system. And we're lying to ourselves as white people if we say that there is not some risk or some natural fear that comes up in us. That's human. And so, you know, if you don't examine that and you don't dive into that, like we're never going to beat this thing. I have this great teacher who, you know, talked about it's not just about learning to say the right thing and not say the wrong thing and not do the wrong thing. Like that is never going to solve white supremacy. That is never going to end racism. It is like sitting in this discomfort and being willing to think about, why am I so scared to give up power? Why do I believe, you know, why do I have this scarcity mindset? Why am I scared? So I can't even now, Aaron, I'm like, what was your original question? I think it was about white fragility, but yeah, I think I want to say that because I think it's so important to acknowledge the very human experience behind it, but push through and say, if you are a white person who understands that all of our liberation is bound up together, then you have to push forward. Because this is the other thing. Yes, we benefit from whiteness as white people, but whiteness is also breaking us
Right.
and holding us back and preventing us from living the best, most fulfilling, full life that we can. And so we have to push through that too.
I want to touch on that. You mentioned fear. So the fear of some white people losing power, I think there's another fear. They fear retaliation.
Sure.
Because, in certain school districts, and you probably know this better than I do, there's certain school districts that won't even touch on Black history because of the fear of retaliation. That's a lot of people, and I can't speak from the white perspective, I can speak from the Black perspective, but we hear and we see that certain people, white people tend to fear Black people because of the retaliation. They're thinking, okay, well, if we allow these people to get into power, especially when Barack Obama was elected, a lot of white people were thinking, not just whites, but other races too, but they were afraid that if he gets in too much power, because we can go back in history, back to when the Reconstruction period, after the Civil War. There were, for a 10-year period from 1865, I believe, actually 12 years, to 1877, there were Black people being elected in South Carolina in certain positions, and then the Ku Klux Klan actually pulled some of those Congress people out into the courtyard and hung them and burned them, on little stakes. So there was a fear of retaliation if certain people of color get into levels of power. Retaliation is a huge fear, and I think that's more than just losing power. Because if you have money in this country, you got power. Whether you're Black, white, Latino, it doesn't matter. And even back then, if you had money, you had power. You might have been restricted by certain groups, but I think the biggest fear is retaliation, in my opinion.
I want to broaden this out a little bit. One of the things that I hear a lot when I talk to other white people about race is, and you get that kind of rejection of this conversation and that discomfort that Lacey was talking about, is this phrase, and I want you guys all to think about this and react to it. I know what it's like to be Black because I grew up poor.
Yeah.
How many times have we all heard that phrase from, I think everyone at this table has.
Yeah.
So what's behind that? How do white people who think that, because I think that is a very natural, not correct, but natural first response for a lot of white people.
Right.
Where's that coming from, and how do you stop doing that? How do people get themselves out of that mindset?
First of all, it's not accurate today. At some point it might have been, but even then it depends on what circles you're swinging in. There was some elite Black folks back then who were doing very well, who owned land, who were able to get land from their former slave owners, and they built a fortune from that within their families. So that exists as well. I'm not surprised of that conversation. I think that if someone was to say, a white person was to say that to me, I'd be like, okay, let's talk. Let's sit and talk about it. Being poor doesn't necessarily mean, because you got Latinos, you got Jews, you got Irish, you got all these people who were poor here in this country and suffered under it was just an elite. This is an elitist nation. It's more classism than racism. Well, sorry.
Careful.
Oh, I was about to get you, Kenny.
Classism exists as well.
Okay.
I remember going to Howard University. I can tell you, one of the things that it was a Black university. There's always been a Black university since it started. However, there was this color code. There was a color code amongst African Americans in there. AKAs kind of blew it up, where they had the comb hanging from the door sill. And if you walk up under it, if your hair didn't pull the comb off, you can join the AKAs. But if it did, they wouldn't allow you in. So people my complexion can get in. So how did that whole university get started? The whole reason got started from some elitist white men having sex with Black women or vice versa. And then the children, they didn't want, especially when it comes to in parts of Louisiana and New Orleans, there was this elitist group, there was a society and what they did was these mulatto children, they sent to Howard University because they wanted to have the best education, even though they felt that having them with them and it would help mess up their whole society or whatever their status in the society they were part of. So being poor doesn't necessarily mean black. And that's how I would just state that, because poorness is something that everyone has experienced. Every race, every group, every organization has experienced some level of poorness. And then, the wealthy is 25% of the population, what I would consider wealthy, making over $250 million a year. So that's my opinion.
How we nip this in the bud. So I'm a big
She's gonna
study
nip it.
person,
Okay. Nip it in the
and we just have to talk about the history again and mobility and what that means and what was created for white poor people in this country, right? I mean, we have Bill O'Reilly, right, who had all of these things, and yet he benefited from the government literally creating a suburban community for white people because his dad was in the military and his family benefited, right, from the GI Bill. And that just happened, right? We are still living with folks who benefited, who have since then, white people who have gone on to create wealth that was not available for black people.
Right.
And when you think about the ability for white people to maneuver through social classes, that doesn't exist to the same extent for black and brown and other people of color. Therefore, what we begin to talk about is, what does a whiteness allow you to do? Right? And Lacey kind of alluded to this, is it allows you to be poor, and even if you are, never be questioned. And yet in this country, when you talk about the ghetto, when you talk about people being poor, you are automatically conjuring up the image of black and brown and people of color, not white people.
Right.
The other thing to remember about this too is we're like, if these poor people would just spend their money and stop buying Jordans, and yet that is not true.
Right.
Studies say that you cannot save your way out of being a black person who doesn't have wealth.
Right.
You cannot put your kids in better schools. You cannot move to better neighborhoods. Studies just came out from Chicago about black people who were trying to buy into the American dream, who could not, and were literally put into debt. And then to your point about black people owning land, there are all of these studies about how much land that black people lost
And that's
in this country. That was stolen from them. Right, and that is even before redlining.
Right.
Run out of town. We've got the stories of Rosewood and Tulsa and all of these things. And so there's also the point that, unlike any other race in this country, every time that black people have ever tried to advance, right, by the mantra of pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, that this country really, puts its hat on, it has been stolen. And so, we have to continue to talk about too, and what does it mean when black people accumulate anything, what happens in this country. And the circumstances that create this have created a class of black people that seem in limbo and unable to move on from the circumstances in which they live within now.
Yeah, I want
On the
to
whole.
talk about that bootstrap culture that you're mentioning, because I think that's part of the unexamined whiteness, right? That's part of this white ideology, that's part of what defines success for white people. That's part of what defines worth, is the ability to pull oneself up, regardless of the truth of that, right? I can say that, I spent several years in serious poverty, and I got my way out of it, and I, did it. I also had grandparents who co-signed my loans for me because they were able to, right? There's this myth, this myth that we perpetuate and embrace and we need. And I think that's a lot of at the root of that fragility and that discomfort and that need to reject being confronted by something, is that we've placed our value as a people on the ability to pull oneself up by one's bootstraps. So when you see someone else not doing it, you look for other causes, right? And the most obvious cause is race.
Well, and no one wants to believe that it wasn't their own intellect or their own hard work or their own whatever that got them wherever they are. I remember talking to my dad years ago about this, and because I was the second person in my family to graduate from a 4-year university, and my dad, I joke with him about this, but it took him 8 or 9 years to graduate from Texas Tech to get his physical education degree. And granted, there's a lot of reasons why that was. He was taking care of his mom, all this stuff, but both of my parents came up from an undereducated family. And my dad talks about just being at the right place at the right time. And he and my mom have accumulated a lot of wealth. And yes, they worked very hard. But my dad will even say to you, I like to hunt. I said I was willing to learn how to golf. And there was this man from Dallas. My dad was in Lubbock. There was this man from Dallas who was willing to take a chance on him because he looked like him, he sounded like him, he liked to hunt, and so did this man. And so this like system and affinity of whiteness goes so much more far beyond what we think it does, you know? That degree didn't matter, none of that mattered, but somebody was willing to take a chance on my dad. And I remember asking him once, you know, because I would say he believes in this bootstrap myth. You know, really, Dad, like if you think that you were black and you were in that same situation, would somebody have taken a chance on you? And he was able in that moment to say, no, I don't think that would have happened. But that doesn't change his, you know, beliefs about the broader myth of bootstrap culture, which is why it's problematic. We may be able to recognize it in a single example in ourselves or in someone else, but that doesn't change the narrative that we hold true about other people.
If I can go back to something you mentioned, Amber, about you know how blacks lost land, they lost land. There was a law that was on the books called peonage. You guys familiar with that? Peonage meant that if you were a homeowner and you were paying on that land, or any type of credit, paying on your house, whatever it was, but if you die, your family inherits that debt. So peonage allowed certain groups of people of who the debtor, not the debtor, the creditor, can come back and take the land and then take other personal items from you to pretty much kick you out on the street with nothing to live off. So peonage was a thing that helped us, it helped the white movement at the time to keep us at a lower place, because it didn't apply to white folks. It only applied to black folks. So if you get a chance, look at peonage. I think that you know, and this is another thing, I'm thinking about this leading up to the show today. I was thinking that, you know, as I get older, I feel empathy for certain people, and I feel more empathy for white people who feel that they have to appear not to be racist. And I can only imagine what that struggle is like, you know what I mean? Because I personally, and I'm sure everyone here in this room knows that all white people are not racist. You know, even if you were brought up in a society or a family or an organization where there's nothing but racism, you know, because some people rise above that. And it's all about, you know, people evolve to the point of learning and education and all that stuff and communicating with other people and realize that these people ain't bad, you know? Just like where I come from was 80-something% African American, that's how I grew up. I knew back then that white folks weren't bad, but everybody around me is talking about how bad white folks were. But I didn't believe that. Go ahead, Erin, I'm sorry.
No. I absolutely take your point, but I think that it's so dangerous to say not all white people are racist.
I agree.
Like,
That's interesting.
yeah, absolutely, sure.
Okay.
Not every single white person is the racist with the tiki torch. Right? But how we define racism, how we understand it really matters, right? Not being a racist doesn't mean you don't have racist ideas and racist upbringing, right? And there's a lot of, going back to the idea of myths, a lot of myths that white kids grow up with without ever realizing that they're myths. Things like, I remember my father telling me when I was a kid, I asked, why is, you know, segregation already ended? I grew up in Southern California. Why is this a black neighborhood? That's a Mexican neighborhood. This is a white neighborhood. And I remember him telling me, people just self-segregate. They like to be with their own kind. And just, okay. You know, being 8 years old, I'm like, all right, I accept that.
It's a typical migration,
But not realizing until I'm an adult what redlining is. That these things are systemic, that they're put in place, right? Why don't people, you know, how come a lot of black people marry black people and white people, and then being told, again, people just like to be with their own kind.
Yeah, that's a natural thing.
Those are little seeds that we put in kids' heads, you know, in the white community at least, that build these myths and they build these racist ideas. And yeah, maybe not every white person is, you know, burning down synagogues and lynching people, but that doesn't excuse all of those myths that build your worldview.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I like to think of racism as a subscription. And in some ways, we have all subscribed. And sometimes when you subscribe to things, you get a benefit, like a free $5 off coupon, right? And who isn't rationally thinking going to cash in that coupon?
Right.
And over again, right? But what if you find out that like your neighbor is never getting their coupons? Would you give it to them? And I've read a book, and one of the things that it says is like the thing around education is that oftentimes people are made to make the choice behind if they're going to be a good parent, which means doing the absolute best for their kids and putting them in the absolute best schools, or if they're going to be a good citizen.
Right.
And I say that to say is that, you know, to Aaron's point, not every white person is a tiki torch person. And yet there are tons of white people who have, whether consciously or unconsciously, made the decision that my white kids will not be in proximity to kids of color. They will not go to schools. They will have the best. And what that means is taking resources and meaning that other kids cannot have those resources. And therefore, so often we are not thinking of, because I have this, it means that someone else doesn't have it. And that is a whole paradigm shift. And so, you know, I was an English major, and so I'm a linguistics person, and I get it, right? Words mean things, and people hate to be called racist. Just like I was talking to one of my friends, and he's like, "You're militant." Baby, I'll pull out a dictionary on you so fast. Militant believes in bearing arms, and I don't even carry guns, nor do I believe in it. So what are you trying to say about me?
Words.
Also, radical.
Radical.
Angela Davis has a great quote: radical just means to take something from the root. And racism is really when you have a prejudice and you have power and you are wielding it. And so I begin to think a lot around like just, and I know that this will get us to a later point, but how do we begin to unpack those things, unpack the language that we use, and then how it makes people feel and like how people land with that. And yet we cannot deny that white people have benefited from racism, and no one is stopping and being like, hey, I got too many coupons, I'm going to send them back. We're not doing that. And, you know, by default, there are a few black people that are winning, right? And we cannot acknowledge that. I mean, I was, you know, all of my dad's sisters and brothers went to college. My grandfather, you know, completed the 8th grade. That was it. And was able to do this for his kids. And yet we also know with our generation of black folks, we are the first generation of people that are slated to make less money than our parents.
Absolutely.
Right? And so it becomes like all of this accommodating to whiteness and trying to get the things that white people has, like how far has it really gotten us, right? And it's because white people aren't at the same time subscribing, like we're ascribing to whiteness, but white people are not coming back and saying, okay, how do we meet in the middle so that we all have the things that we need?
Yeah, it makes me think of the phrase complicit, like all white people are complicit in the system, and you have to like actively divest. And even when you are doing that, you are somehow still in some way being complicit in this system of white supremacy. And it also makes me think about your first question, Erin, which was around the different types or levels of racism that, you know, what we think is anecdotal, like black and white people didn't want to marry each other, didn't want to live in the same neighborhood, like, no, that was systemic, right? There were laws in place, maybe not when we were alive, that, you know, at some point that's not in people's memory anymore. And all they do remember is the narrative around it and not the law itself. Because racism is not just personal. So yeah, I think all white people are complicit in racism, and I think that's why it's so damn hard to end white supremacy. Because to your point around coupons, you do have to give something up. And even as I'm saying that, I feel my own cognitive dissonance of this belief that there's enough to go around, and that we can share
there really
power. Yeah, but also this like understanding and knowing that there's something that white people have to give up.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's my naivete. I still, just through my own personal experience, I've been here for 54 years. I feel that all people aren't, but from your point of view, from both your point of view, you know, complicity, which means that you played a role. So did you have a role in white supremacy? Did you have a role in racism? Because racist is people who have the power to prevent other people of another race from having certain things. So does that mean all white people are racist? Because we know there's a lot of white people who don't have the races, even though they benefit. They have like a green card. We used to call it back in the day. We had a green card. White people had a green card to do whatever they wanted, especially when it came to justice. So, and that could be a whole different show right there. But does that mean that you're actually complicit, or you just benefited?
I think we're complicit. I think we make choices every day, one way or the other, that upholds this system or disrupts this system.
So what would you do to change that if you're not happy with it? I mean, because I'm thinking if I'm a part of something that's bad for most people, or at least 14% of the people, then, or maybe including Latinos, probably 26% of the people, then what am I doing to change it? I mean, this show could be one of those tools, but what would you do to change it?
Yeah, I mean, I have come, it's funny because we started off this conversation with this very broad, like, national story, right? And the more I learn about this and the more I think and the more I watch, the more that I think that this is like hyper personal, hyper local work. And the cool thing is that most of the personal work you do, whether it's cultivating vulnerability or whatever you may be working on in yourself, is inherently fighting against white supremacy. Because white supremacy loves control, it loves fear, it loves separation. So I think, working on yourself, actually loving yourself, being in authentic relationship with others is like one tiny but very important step. And that's just on the personal level, right? I think the structural, systemic examples matter as well. Like, I'm a manager at my work. How I choose to wield my quote unquote power at work is actually either going to contribute to or take away from the system of white supremacy.
Interesting.
The point you made about schools. I have a 1-year-old son, and I'm already thinking about what am I going to do when he goes to school, because that's where you put your money where your mouth is. Like, what are you going to do? No one wants to experiment on their kids, and yet if everybody's making that choice, we're just going to have more of the same.
And you wouldn't be wrong if you want the best school for your child, even though that school may be predominantly white.
Well, but there's a question then. What
Okay.
makes
Is
the
it
best
best?
school?
Right.
Well,
And that
Okay.
that goes to the heart of Amber's point earlier, right? Is the
Gotcha.
best school, does that mean a white school?
Right.
Yeah.
Or is the best school
That's
one where your
Yeah.
kid is exposed to different cultures?
Yeah, and I would say as someone, so my dad is from Birmingham, Alabama. I was born here in Dallas, lived in Germany, then went to Birmingham, and lived in a very affluent neighborhood in Birmingham that would be equivalent to Highland Park here. Went to the best schools, had like a teacher that was
The best school? I was kidding.
what you would perceive.
Right,
a teacher
right,
that was
okay.
a songwriter, she was
Right.
like Lil Nas
Oh, okay.
X in the classroom.
Gotcha.
And my parents separated, and we came to Dallas, to Pleasant Grove specifically. And I remember my school being so different.
Yeah.
And I thought that I was at a bad school because I was in class in a portable.
Right.
I was never in class with other black and brown students,
Wow.
to be honest. And I barely had books, and if we did, they were raggedy and they were torn apart. And I remember being in that school, y'all, and that is where I found out where I was identified as a gifted student, which we know black and brown students and students of color are way less likely to be identified by their teachers.
Absolutely.
And so what I say is, had I not been at a bad school, I never probably would have been identified as a gifted student in this way had I continued to go through a white school system. And I think that it's because we don't see value in communities of color. All right. And so that's where we do, you talked about a root cause analysis. the other tool to that is like, where are our asset mapping tools, right? Like, where are we saying if, like, and I was at a community organizing meeting for a school in Dallas, and we were talking about parents. And here we are, you know, in South Dallas, talking about there's no parent engagement. On a Saturday morning, got 10 parents and their kids there wanting what's best for their schools and not having the resources there. And so what if they had someone like any of us in this room, right? Who would for once get out of our own egos and heads and what we think is best and be in community with people, right? And so it really becomes like, what do we think that we gain from these systems? And is what we gain better and more valuable than our collective humanity? And I think we get away from that.
Yeah, I want us to, we're already kind of there, but I want us to transition specifically into kind of a call to action. Like, what can people actually do? Lacey, you kind of already touched on that, but one of the things that came to mind while you were talking was ways to share power. How do we share power, right? What are things that we can do, especially as white people, to support communities of color, to share that power, to start giving away those coupons? And one of the things that popped into my head first was supporting artists and businesses run by people of color. I went to, just as an example, I went to a fantastic museum exhibit last week in Colorado by the portrait painter Jordan Castile. If you've never looked at her, look at her work.
I went to college with Jordan. She went to Agnes Scott.
Wow.
She was there when I was there. She's
Wow.
amazing.
So she's an
Super dope black woman.
I'm sorry, what was the name again?
Jordan Castile.
Jordan Castile. Okay.
Yes. Her work is fantastic. And one of the really cool things that I just kind of experienced in this moment was getting to go see her exhibit, you know, spending a little bit of money toward her art, being a person in that space, supports her. And how much I got back from that exhibit was incredible. The exhibit, if you want to look it up, it's called Returning the Gaze. And it was so, the wonderful moment that I experienced at the beginning of the show, you started talking about the white gaze, right? And that kind of connection, that had I not gone to that exhibit last week and supported this artist, I wouldn't have had that mental connection when Amber said that. So that's just an example for me of like tiny ways that you can actually start sharing power. Go get into spaces that support people of color, right? Without, and this caveat is important, without being the person who says something, you know, along the lines of like, well, I don't have any black friends, let me insert myself into a group of black people because I need you to help me, right?
I need black friends really bad.
Right, like, please don't be that person.
Right,
But
right,
there's
right.
a way you can support it and get something out of it for yourself, right?
Would you support it just because it's black, or
So, I mean,
was something that interests you?
Yeah, I mean, I love
Okay.
art. So
Gotcha.
going to that exhibit, I was going to go to that museum anyway. Seeing that exhibit, seeing
Right.
the brochures, I was like, oh, that looks incredible.
Right.
Walking into that space was a changing experience. Her portraits are incredible.
So for you, it would be not avoiding because it's a black organization.
Right. Well, and
So,
I think there's
okay.
something to be said, though, for seeking it out.
Right.
Right?
Okay.
It would be very easy for me to just grow up or listen to the music that I grew up on. My dad likes the Beatles, my dad likes jazz, my dad likes certain things. It's very easy for me to listen to just those things.
Right.
My students are mostly people of color.
Right.
99% of them are. It's just as easy for me to invest in them and like, what are you talking about with this artist? Okay, let me listen to that. I don't love it, but now I understand it, right? And then I'll come across another one that I'm like, yeah, I like that. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
It's not difficult to just invest in those different communities, invest in their art, and then get something back from it. So what are you guys thinking about, like actual calls to action, actual ways to start sharing power?
Yeah, some things that I'm thinking is, and I neglect that I haven't mentioned this earlier, is really thinking about Indigenous people in this country and their role. I was listening to, when I was coming over, a thing about the American Samoan community and how important it is for us to recognize that in this place, especially being so close to Arlington, we are on cattle land.
Yes.
Right? We are
Yes.
on indigenous native land. And then also the other part of acknowledging that is, as black people that are in this country, we are indigenous people,
Yes.
stolen from our indigenous land. And so what that means, right, to carry into spaces when I'm doing presentations, I always love to start with that. and really get people thinking about that. I also think a lot about, to that point of how do I become an ally for other people of color? And so have really been spending a lot more time organizing in the work that I do with folks from the Asian American Pacific Islander community who have often said, Lacey and I have a mutual friend who often says we feel left out from these conversations. And so, you know, what does it mean to make sure that these conversations are all inclusive, right? And so when I'm saying, you know, when I'm talking about people of color, I'm also talking about them. And naming them and supporting in solidarity. And then, like, to Aaron's point about like what we can go see and do, go see the Toni Morrison documentary. It is amazing. Yeah. She is a great, and The Last Man in San Francisco. But really, how do we like tell our stories and continue to know them?
Interesting.
Yeah. Not to sound cheesy, but I'm going back to that, like, I have two thoughts. First, I'm going back to that personal work. Because I think it is like, it is so ingrained in us. Whether you're white or whether you're a person of color, it is so ingrained in us, these myths that we all believe and have been exposed to. And so it takes a lot to like unlearn and uproot that. And I by no means am claiming that I've somehow arrived at the other side of that. I haven't. And for the rest of my life, I will be working on that, and it will still be insufficient. And the second one, I think, is a white person, speaking specifically to white folks. Talk to other white folks.
Please and thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's so easy to, you know, live within your echo chamber of people that believe like you do. It's so easy to, in relationships where you know somebody's going to disagree with you, to live in fear of confrontation or to confront another person to the point that you lose the relationship. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy, it's complex, it's hard, but I think that like heart work, that relationship work is the only way this stuff is ever really going to change. And yes, like vote and run for office and, you know, advocate for inclusive anti-racist policies, like do all of those things, and also be a human. Be a human who connects with other humans in your shared humanity. Can I read a quote?
Absolutely.
So I don't know this person. This was shared.
Kenny Woodfolk. No, I was kidding. I'll take credit. Hey.
His name is Rod Owens, and this was shared with me in a class I was taking called Holding Whiteness Responsibly. But this is what he says about white people. And he's a black man. He says, "It seems like if we are really interested in ending white supremacy, white people should focus more on loving themselves instead of trying to love me. The violence emerges from the ways self-shame and apathy are bypassed in attempts to use love towards me as an argument, trying to convince me that you are not that kind of white person. As long as you cannot face yourself and love even those ugly parts, you are indeed that kind of white person. And I will be left with the work of trying to love what you cannot bear to witness."
Wow.
That's a really great
good.
kind of quote to end on. I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Lacey. So we are going to post some of these ideas that we have and maybe more that occur to us afterwards on our website, which is wethepeoplepod.com. If you want
Can I throw one in?
Yeah.
Because I didn't actually
Oh,
get a
I'm
chance.
sorry.
No, it's okay. No. You're busy. You're hosting. No. Just, you know, I'm a career HR professional. So one of the things we worked on within my profession is diversity and inclusion. You know, back to your question, you know, how can we support, how can we help this cause? I think that thinking diverse, meaning talking to people that don't look like you, they don't talk like you know, they don't walk there, they don't have the same history as you, they don't have the same background, culture, education, whatever it is. That's where we start reaching out and being diverse within our groups, within our associations. But the other part is inclusion, including them into your circle, you know, not just because they're different, but because you develop an intellectual curiosity of who they are and what makes them tick, you know, what makes them breathe, you know, whether it's religion, whether it's culture, whether it's all these other things, and find out. I used to tell students when I did a couple of presentations with some kids up here at SMU back in 2014, some of the questions they were asking, I said, well, if you want to learn people and study people, go take some minor classes in theology. because that's where people live, whether you're religious or not. If you want to start working on your diversity and you want to work on your inclusion, you got to understand how these people walk and breathe. So that was just one thing I would just say.
Awesome. I appreciate that. All right, so we are running out of time, so everybody feel free to tweet at us. We_the_people_pod on Twitter. Our website is wethepeoplepod.com. Come visit us, talk to us. Let's keep this dialogue going throughout the week, especially. Next week, We the People will dive into the resurgence of discriminatory practices and policies coming out of Washington and Austin, which target the LGBTQ plus community. We have a great panel lined up for next week. You guys are going to love it. Until then, stay safe but active. Please remember that you are responsible for change as much as anyone in a position of political power. Today's show was produced by both me and Kenny. It was engineered by Nerea King, and the music was written and produced by Josh Lowe. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.